I still can't believe that this happened. I'm sure you won't believe it either. So, first things first. The room hummed with restless energy as students trickled in, some juggling notebooks, others clutching their morning coffee like lifelines. It was just another Tuesday at Whitmore University, a respected institution tucked away in the heart of Oregon. Inside room 302, a class on cultural criticism was about to commence, led by the one and only Professor Eleanor Grayson. Grayson's name carried weight. To some, she was an intellectual powerhouse, unafraid to dissect the world's flaws. To others, she was a provocateur, known for her bold critiques and unapologetic opinions. She thrived on pushing boundaries, often using well-known figures as case studies to expose societal contradictions. Among the students settling into their seats, a young man sat quietly in the third row. Tall and composed, he kept his head low, blending in with the sea of eager learners. No one paid him any mind, just another student in a hoodie and jeans. But if anyone had looked a little closer, they might have recognized him. Barron Trump had chosen this life deliberately. Enrolling under an assumed name, he sought something simple, anonymity. He wanted to be more than just a last name, more than a legacy shaped by the public eye. Here, in the walls of academia, he hoped to form his own thoughts without the weight of expectations pressing down on him. As the murmurs in the room died down, Professor Grayson took her place at the podium. She exuded authority, her mere presence demanding attention. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice crisp and unwavering. "Today, we are diving into the concept of public image, how it is built, manipulated, and, in some cases, weaponized. And to illustrate, we will be looking at real-world examples." Barron shifted slightly in his seat, his face unreadable. He had not known what to expect from this class, but something told him this was going to be more than just an intellectual exercise. Professor Grayson had a reputation, not just as an academic but as a cultural force. With a doctorate from Stanford and a prolific career in social critique, she was no stranger to controversy. Her lectures often sparked viral debates, some called her brilliant, others saw her as divisive. Either way, her classes were packed, students drawn in by the promise of sharp insights and, often, brutal honesty. Today was no exception. She moved effortlessly through her examples, dissecting the disparity between the public image of influential figures and the reality lurking beneath. The class hung on her every word, captivated by her sharp wit and confident delivery. But then, her tone shifted. A name left her lips, and Barron felt his entire body go still. "Take Melania Trump, for instance," she said, pacing the stage with an air of authority. "A woman revered for her grace and elegance. But what does that say about us? Have we truly reduced our values to such shallow standards? Have beauty and silence become the traits we most admire?" A ripple of reaction spread through the room. Some students nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Barron felt a familiar pressure settle in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Grayson continued, her words laced with pointed sarcasm. "And what about intelligence? Contribution? Influence that extends beyond appearances? Is this really the ideal we wish to uphold for young women today?" Barron's gaze dropped to the desk in front of him, his thoughts moving fast. He had signed up for this course out of genuine interest in intellectual debate, eager to engage with different perspectives. But this felt different. It was no longer just an abstract discussion. It was personal. Around him, his classmates absorbed every word, some even chuckling at Grayson's remarks. She had a way of making her arguments feel absolute, her delivery nearly impossible to challenge. But for Barron, this was not just a lecture. It was a provocation. A line had been drawn, and he was not sure he could stay silent. And Professor Grayson? She was just getting started. Professor Grayson circled back to Melania Trump, dissecting every detail, her public speeches, her carefully chosen words, even the infamous jacket that read, "I really do not care, do you?" The students leaned in, captivated by the sharpness of her analysis, her ability to take apart an image piece by piece. "She is a symbol," Grayson declared, gesturing with conviction. "But a symbol of what? A relic of an era long past? A time when women were expected to stand quietly behind powerful men, to smile and say nothing of consequence?" A few chuckles rippled through the class. Others murmured in agreement. The room's energy shifted, growing more intense as Grayson pressed forward. "It is fascinating," she continued, her voice laced with amusement. "How quickly we confuse silence for grace, compliance for class. What exactly are we teaching the next generation when we hold up figures like this as role models?" Barron's hands clenched into fists beneath his desk. This was no longer an abstract debate, it was personal. Grayson was not just criticizing a public figure, she was attacking his mother. For years, he had watched people judge Melania, treating her as little more than an image, a former model, an accent to be mocked. But that was not the woman he knew. She was fiercely private, deeply intelligent, and had protected her family with quiet resilience. Grayson's words felt like a direct insult, not just to Melania but to everything she stood for. "And what if," Grayson continued, her tone now dripping with sarcasm, "we chose to celebrate women who actually make a difference, instead of those who simply wear designer gowns?" This time, laughter rolled through the room. Barron felt something twist inside him. He scanned the faces around him, some amused, some indifferent. No one seemed to question the one-sidedness of it all. Still, he said nothing. Not yet. Whether it was out of respect for the professor, the fear of exposing his identity, or simply knowing how unwelcome his family name likely was in that environment, he was not sure. But something inside him burned, a quiet, growing resolve. Grayson was not finished. She paced the front of the room, her words gaining momentum. "And let us not forget the irony," she added, smirking slightly. "A woman whose public statements are few and far between, yet include gems like, 'Be best,' a slogan so grammatically awkward you have to wonder, does it reflect a lack of understanding? Or simply a lack of care?" The class erupted in laughter again, louder this time. Barron felt heat rush to his face. His heart pounded against his ribs, not from anger, but from something more complicated, frustration, disappointment. For all her intelligence, for all her ability to deconstruct narratives, Professor Grayson was using her platform not to enlighten, but to humiliate. She was tearing someone down who was not even there to defend herself. His parents had taught him to remain composed, to never escalate, to let actions speak louder than words. But this was not a moment for silence. For years, Barron had stayed in the background, letting the world say what it wanted about his family, never engaging, never responding. But sitting in that lecture hall, he felt a responsibility, not just to his mother, but to the idea of fairness itself. He took a slow, steady breath. His hand rested on the desk, fingers tightening for just a moment. Then, without hesitation, he raised it. It was not rushed, not dramatic. It was controlled, deliberate, like a shift in gravity, a moment that felt impossibly slow. Professor Grayson, mid-sentence, caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. She paused. Her gaze narrowed as she turned to look at him. "Yes?" Professor Grayson asked, her tone clipped, as if irritated by the interruption. Barron rose to his feet with a calm, deliberate motion. The room, which had been alive with laughter moments ago, fell completely silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward him, curiosity thick in the air. They did not recognize him, not yet, but there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. "I think you are missing something important," he said, his voice clear and measured. There was no anger, no defensiveness, just an unshakable confidence that made people lean in, listening closer. But as he spoke, it became obvious this was not just about defending his mother. Barron Trump was shifting the entire conversation. His voice remained steady, unyielding. "You talk about my mother as if she is just an image, a reflection of what people want her to be. But have you ever considered the person beyond the headlines? Professor Grayson blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. A few students exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that this was not the response they had expected. Still, Barron continued, his words precise, each syllable hitting with quiet intensity. My mother was not born into privilege. She grew up in a small town in Slovenia, in a family that did not have much. She worked hard to build a life for herself in a world that constantly judged her, her accent, her looks, her past. And yet, she succeeded. She learned 5 languages, built a career, and eventually became the First Lady of the United States. Not because she sought fame or power, but because she believed in her family and the values that shaped her. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Some students shifted in their seats, while others leaned in, captivated by the unexpected depth of his words. Barron's eyes locked onto Professor Grayson, his tone unwavering. You say she represents outdated ideals. But maybe the problem is not her. Maybe the problem is how we, as a society, decide what is worth celebrating. You criticize her for being quiet, but is there not strength in choosing your words carefully? In speaking only when you have something meaningful to say? The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed down on the room, settling over the students like an invisible weight. Even Grayson, who was known for her quick rebuttals, hesitated. And let us not pretend, Barron continued, his voice carrying through the stillness, that people like my mother do not pay a price for everything they do. Every smile, every gesture, every mistake is dissected, mocked, and judged by people who have never walked a day in their shoes. We tear people down so easily, but do we ever stop to consider what it costs to live under that kind of scrutiny? He let the words linger, allowing the room to fully absorb them. For the first time, Barron was no longer just another student. The others saw him now, saw the weight he carried, the experiences that most of them could not begin to comprehend. And yet, he was not finished. Something deeper was unfolding in that room, a shift that went beyond the lecture itself. For a moment, it felt as though the entire space was frozen in time, everyone holding their breath. Then, the faint shuffle of papers broke the silence, followed by soft murmurs and whispered reactions. Some students remained still, their expressions a mixture of shock and admiration, while others exchanged uneasy glances, as if reconsidering their stance. Professor Grayson, normally quick to reassert control, hesitated. For the first time, her assured composure wavered. Then, regaining her poise, she folded her arms and nodded. Those are compelling points, she admitted. Her tone remained steady, but there was a trace of defensiveness beneath it. But is it not fair to scrutinize public figures, she asked. Especially when they hold positions that influence millions? Barron nodded, his expression calm and composed. It is fair to scrutinize actions, he said, his voice clear and deliberate. But what you are doing is not scrutiny. It is mockery. It is easy to judge someone based on what you see from the outside, but it is much harder to understand the full story. What if, instead of tearing people down, we shifted the conversation to the values behind the image? Professor Grayson opened her mouth, ready to counter, but then hesitated. Something in the room had shifted. She seemed to sense it, choosing her next words carefully. And then, from the back of the room, a sound broke the silence. A slow, hesitant clap. It was tentative at first, almost uncertain. Then another student joined in. And another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. The sound was more than just approval, it was a release, an acknowledgement that something rare had just happened. A real conversation had unfolded, one that was not about winning an argument, but about seeing things from another perspective. A student in the back raised his hand. I never really thought about it like that, he admitted. Maybe we are too quick to judge people we do not actually know. Another student nodded. Yeah, it is easy to point fingers, but we forget that public figures are still human beings. The ripple effect of Barron's words was undeniable. Professor Grayson, standing at the podium, scanned the room. The dynamic had shifted. What had started as her lecture had turned into something more, an open, raw exchange of ideas. And she had not entirely anticipated it. Barron sat back down quietly, his anonymity gone. He did not smile, did not bask in the attention. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost distant, as the applause faded. This moment was not about applause. It was about the impact his words would leave behind. The lecture ended, but the atmosphere in the room lingered, like the aftershock of an earthquake. Students packed up their things slowly, whispering to one another, replaying the exchange in their minds. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone challenge Professor Grayson in a way that was not combative, but transformative. As Barron gathered his belongings, keeping his head down, a few students approached him hesitantly. "Hey, that was brave," one of them said, her voice tinged with admiration. "You really made me think differently about things." He gave a faint smile, nodding in acknowledgement. He did not say much, he was not looking for praise. This was never about winning an argument. It was about shifting the conversation. And judging by the quiet, thoughtful discussions happening all around him, he had done exactly that. Meanwhile, Professor Grayson remained at the podium, flipping through her notes as if searching for something solid to hold on to. A few students approached her with questions, but even she seemed less sure-footed than usual. As she finally left the lecture hall, her expression was not one of victory, it was one of contemplation. But the impact of the moment did not stop at the classroom doors. Later that day, snippets of the exchange began circulating online. A student had recorded part of Barron's response and uploaded it with the caption, "When the quietest person in the room changes everything." Within hours, the clip gained traction. Social media exploded with debates about respect, public perception, and the importance of speaking up. Across campus, students dissected what had happened. Had Grayson gone too far? Was Barron right to challenge her? For the first time in a long while, the campus buzzed with meaningful dialogue, not gossip, not petty drama, but real conversations about values, judgment, and humanity. And Professor Grayson, so often firm in her convictions, so often unwavering in her critiques, found herself replaying Barron's words over and over in her mind. That evening, as she prepared for her next class, she paused, staring at her notes. Something about her usual approach felt different now. Hollow, even. For all her critiques of public figures, she had overlooked something essential. Compassion is not weakness. It is a strength. But this was only the beginning. What had started as a single moment in a lecture hall was about to ripple far beyond the university's walls. A week later, room 302 buzzed with anticipation once again. This time, though, the energy was different. Students arrived early, filling the seats, speaking in hushed but eager tones about what had happened the week before. The confrontation had not just been another classroom debate, it had left an impact, one that had not faded with time. Professor Grayson stood at the podium, as she always did, but something about her seemed changed. The usual commanding presence was still there, yet there was a new humility in the way she carried herself. She took a breath before beginning. "Last week, something remarkable happened in this room," she said, her voice steady but reflective. "I was challenged in a way that made me reconsider, not just my argument, but my approach to teaching. And for that, I owe all of you, especially one of you." She glanced briefly toward Barron. "My gratitude." A hush fell over the room. No one had expected this, an admission, not of defeat, but of growth. "Criticism is important," she continued, "but so is understanding. We cannot truly analyze or challenge societal norms without empathy. And last week, I failed to extend that empathy to the subject of my critique. For that, I apologize." Barron sat in his usual seat, unmoving, his expression neutral. Then, with the slightest motion, he nodded. He did not need a grand apology. The shift in tone was enough. But the impact of that day did not stay confined to a single lecture hall. It spread. Conversations ignited across campus, conversations not just about public figures, but about how people engaged with ideas, with one another. Students began to reflect, not only on what they debated but how they debated. Social media lit up with discussions on fairness, respect, and the fine line between critique and ridicule. Some praised Barron's response, others debated the nature of the argument itself. But one thing was certain, something had changed. For Barron, though, life moved on quietly, just as he preferred. He returned to his studies, avoiding attention where he could. He had never wanted to be a focal point. But despite his best efforts, his actions had left a mark. Without intending to, he had taught a lesson that reached beyond any single lecture. A lesson about standing firm in your beliefs, not with outrage, not with bitterness, but with quiet conviction. The moral was simple yet powerful. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, it takes courage to stand up for fairness and humanity. Respect does not weaken critical thought, it strengthens it. It reminds us that even in disagreement, we can choose empathy over mockery. As the semester unfolded, the students who had witnessed that moment carried its message with them. And like ripples in water, its effect continued to spread, far beyond Whitmore University. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, pause and ask yourself. Are you challenging the idea? Or are you tearing down the person?